We're just letting participants join the room here, so we'll just give it a minute here for folks to get admitted into Zoom. Good evening. Leah, does it look like that's everybody let in?
Yes, it looks like it is leveled off.
Great. Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Nate Pamplin, and welcome to our Puget Sound Salmon Fishing Town Hall. I serve as our Director of External Affairs with the department and will help facilitate tonight's meeting. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. When we were preparing for tonight's meeting and organizing the topics and material, we really wanted to gear our information to anglers and members of the public that might be new to Puget Sound salmon fisheries management and help orient them to this issue and address some of the regulatory complexity. And my guess is that for those of you that are attending that are the diehard salmon enthusiasts and you serve on our advisory groups or attend the various North of Falcon public meetings each season, that you'll also get something out of this too. Puget Sound salmon management is arguably one of the most complicated mixed stock fisheries in the world, and I know I pick up something new each time I hear from our team. For tonight, we've assembled our key executives and senior managers, biologists and scientists that work on this issue to help provide an overview. We'll take a look back at the 2023 salmon seasons and some of the decisions made in season to achieve our conservation objectives. And we'll look ahead to see what's in store for 2024 in terms of opportunities and constraints. We'll also be sure to monitor the clock and reserve some time at the end to have a question and answer session and get to your questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Leah and ask her to walk through some of the logistics of using Zoom. And then we'll introduce staff that are doing the presentations before getting underway with some opening remarks from Director Susowin and Fish Program Director Cunningham, and then on to our staff presentations. Go ahead, Leah.
Please note the following guidelines for our webinar. Upon entering the webinar, your microphone will be muted automatically. To ask a question, please use the raise hand feature. If you're joining by phone, dial *9, and if you're joining via computer, use the hand icon at the bottom of your screen. During the comment period, the host will enable you to unmute yourself. You can then unmute yourself by pressing the mute button or on your device or dialing *6 on your phone. If you face any technical issues during the webinar, please let us know in the chat and we will assist you. We expect all participants to treat each other with respect and refrain from making personal attacks, insults, or threats. Please keep discussions focused on the issues and questions at hand and avoid attacking individuals or organizations. The use of offensive, disrespectful, or derogatory language, including profanity, is strictly prohibited. To ensure a balanced discussion, please limit the length and frequency of your contributions to the conversation and assume positive intentions from those speaking and listen respectfully. Thanks, Nate.
Great. Thank you, Leah. And let's do a round of introductions. I'll start with the director, and then director, if you just kind of point to somebody else, and we'll move down through the list of presenters.
All right, thank you, Nate. Kelly Susowin, Director of Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I'll kick it over to Kelly Cunningham.
Thank you, Director Susowin. Evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Kelly Cunningham. I'm the Director of the Fish Program, and I'll turn it over to Kyle Addix, our Intergovernmental Salmon Manager.
Good evening, everyone. As Kelly said, my name is Kyle Addix. I'm the Intergovernmental Salmon Manager for the WDFW Fish Program. I will pass it on to Mark Waltzell.
Good evening, everybody. Mark Waltzell, Statewide Salmon and Steelhead Manager. Next up is Dr. Marisa Litz.
Thanks, Mark. I'm Dr. Marisa Litz. I'm a research scientist in the Fish Science Division with DFW, and I will pass it over to Kirsten Simonson.
Thanks, Marisa. I'm Kirsten Simonson. I am the Puget Sound Recreational Salmon Manager for WDFW, and I will pass it down to Dr. Derek Dapp.
Thanks, Kirsten. Hello, everybody. I'm Derek Dapp. I work as a salmon modeler within the WDFW.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So let's go to opening remarks, starting with Director Susewin and then turning it over to Fish Program Director Cunningham. Go ahead.
Thanks, Nate. My main objective here is to make sure I thank everybody for being here tonight. We know you're busy and took some time out of your schedule for this event. This really is a huge deal. This is the beginning of our annual North of Falcon season settings. And it really is the core of how we manage at least fisheries around salmon. Everybody here knows salmon are an icon in the Northwest. They're a foundation for our economy, a foundation for our culture. If you're here tonight, you're likely an avid angler and very interested in how things are going to roll out this year. And we have the team here that sets those seasons for you. These guys, I'll tell you, I've been here about 5 years now, and every year I'm more and more impressed at how hard they work to find every opportunity they can. People concerned about some closed doors. I'll tell you what's going on behind those closed doors is these guys eking out every bit of opportunity they can within our mandate. Our mandate requires that we take conservation first. Our primary goal is to sustain these runs so that we can have these opportunities now and in the future. Your grandkids and their grandkids, we want out there doing the same thing, hopefully even more so than today. That results in some changes during season and some shortened seasons, and we know that's frustrating. You folks are, especially, as I said, if you're here tonight, you're one of probably our more avid anglers. You're making plans a year in advance, and it's tough when we see those changes. But I can tell you that every one of those is agonized over. We do not take those changes, or especially shortening seasons, lightly, but we're in a spot where we feel we need to for conservation. And so we make those tough decisions. It can be confusing for folks too. So hopefully tonight we'll get a little better feeling for all that. We work in, as Nate said earlier, a mixed stock area from the ocean all the way to that terminal area. There are multiple stocks there. So you might be having great fishing because you have a healthy stock available, but it's mixed in with a constrained stock, a stock that's not doing well. And we have to protect that weak stock in order to make sure we have a sustainable fishery going forward. And so it doesn't always add up if you don't know all the mathematics that goes in the background. So I appreciate you all being here. We're going to go into some depth. As Nate said, we'll make sure those that are just joining us for the first time can get a good foundation, and those that have been here for a while can learn something new, we hope. Thank you for being here. We really do take your input seriously. When we make those changes, we try to work with our advisory groups and the public. We're here tonight because we want to know, as these folks are working to grind out those seasons, we want to make sure we're doing that in a way that meets what you want. We've got limitations. We can't offer everything. So we want to make sure what we offer is in line with what your desires are as best we can. So with that, I will turn it over to the program that actually does the work, and that would be Mr. Cunningham.
Thank you, Kelly. Appreciate it. I'll be really brief. Appreciate those, Kelly and Nate, your comments early on about the complexity of these fisheries. I think folks would be hard pressed to find a more complex fishery management regime than what exists for us, all of us here in Washington. And I greatly appreciate and agree with the sentiments associated with the amount of work that goes into prosecuting these fisheries and the level of talent and dedication that WDFW has, working hard for the benefit of Washington's anglers and making sure that we got our conservation objectives in front of us as we prosecute these fisheries. One of the things I want to share is that this meeting, this town hall is new, right? We have a really extensive public process associated with the North of Falcon salmon season setting workload. That process and those meetings can be found on our website. It's wild and woolly is one way to put it. It starts out fast and furious, and as we near the end, it becomes I guess what I would say is if you're a member of the general public trying to track this process, it's hard on a good day. And as we get towards the finish line, it's really hard because things happen quickly. And I know that causes a lot of frustration for you all who are trying to track the process or even understand it. So this meeting tonight is our attempt to try to, as Kelly and Nate mentioned, provide some insight into what goes into the salmon season setting process every year, and the issues that we have to deal with in terms of managing these fisheries and agreeing on these fisheries. So this is new for us. This kind of as Kelly mentioned, it's kicking off our North of Falcon process. We hope you find it valuable. For us, it's been really important to work with our public affairs folks because we can get mired into the weeds really quickly. And it's been really helpful to have our public affairs folks kind of pull us up and have us talk about these issues in a way that might be more digestible, if you will, by you all. That said, we got some time at the end here. We're hoping for some engagement. We're hoping for some good questions from you all. Not that there's a bad question, because again, it's complex. It takes a few shots at it to maybe understand exactly what we're talking about. So please don't be shy about raising your hand. If we don't get through everything tonight, you know how to get a hold of us. We're happy to engage with you if you got additional questions after the fact, but we want to be respectful of people's time. And we got a couple of hours scheduled together. We're going to do our best to stay on track, but please don't let that limit your questions. And with that, I'll stop taking up valuable airspace and I'll turn it over to Kyle, who will get the program underway. Thank you all.
Thanks, Kelly. And as we get the slide presentation pulled up, just to clarify, we're going to get through our presentation and hold questions till the end. We want to make sure we get through the information, but we're going to try to get through it to leave that time at the end to answer questions. So as you all know, we're here for the first I know of its kind Puget Sound Salmon Fishing Town Hall. I'm going to kick us off on the next slide with just an overview of our annual process for planning our salmon fisheries, planning and implementing our salmon fisheries. And this is in the form of a timeline that starts in January of each year. I like to think of this as a circular process that never really has an end, kind of like the salmon life cycle diagrams you've probably seen in the past. But as we move into our process, it really happens in January and February of each year as our state and tribal staff develop salmon run forecast. So they use all the data we have on past salmon returns, sit down and figure out what our best estimate of the number of each species and stock of salmon that will return in the upcoming year are. As we get to the end of February, we release those forecasts. We'll have a big public kickoff meeting you'll hear about later, where we tell the public what all those forecasts are. And from there, we jump right into the Pacific Fishery Management Council process. I'll say a little bit about that more later. But this is the process where we work with the other states, with tribal and federal fisheries managers to develop preliminary options for ocean fisheries based on the current year's forecast. As we move further into March, we have a long series of public meetings where we take input on what the public would like to see for fishing seasons. Of course, they have to be within line of what our preseason forecast and our conservation objectives are. But we have meetings broken out regionally around the state for the Washington coast, for the Columbia River, and for Puget Sound. And as we move through that process, we start to develop draft regulations for state fisheries based on all of that public input, our co-manager negotiations, and what the PFMC ocean fisheries will look like. We have a pretty complex conservation objective and legal framework that we also have to fit those fisheries within. So we have conservation objectives, limits on the impact we can have on all of our species and stocks. We have the US v. Oregon and US v. Washington court cases and all of the agreements that have come out from those in the years. We have the Magnuson-Stevens Act for federal fisheries. We have the Endangered Species Act for species that are listed under the ESA. When we have state law and the Pacific Salmon Treaty that we also have to be mindful of. Next slide. As we get into early April, the Pacific Fishery Management Council will have its second meeting and they'll adopt final recommended regulations for ocean fisheries. And at that time, we can cement our plans for all of our inside fisheries in Puget Sound, coastal Washington, and the Columbia River. As we put all of those fisheries together, they have to meet all of those conservation requirements and be within the legal framework. In the recent past, for Puget Sound fisheries in particular, we've had to submit our fisheries plan for Puget Sound fisheries to the National Marine Fisheries Service for environmental review and approval. I'll speak a little bit about that later. And then as we move into May and June, we finish the formal Administrative Procedure Act process for adopting new fishing regulations. We have additional public hearings, and eventually the director adopts the fishing regulations for the year. Once all that's done, we can actually start implementing our fisheries around the state. And on the left at the bottom here, you see the co-management process, which goes on throughout the season development process, as well as the fishery management and implementation process. We implement those seasons. We do pretty intense monitoring of what the catch and encounters in those fisheries are. And sometimes we have to modify those seasons based on what we see in the fisheries and what we learn about returning run sizes of salmon. And on the right side, you see a sort of separate but linked process that goes on. As fisheries end and salmon escape into natural spawning grounds and hatcheries, we're assessing those returns. Those fish lay their eggs, juveniles hatch, head back out to marine waters at some point. We're monitoring how many juveniles are leaving freshwater. And then we have a ton of environmental data that's collected, not most of that not collected by WDFW, but a lot of organizations collecting that data. All of those things drive our salmon stock assessment data sets. And as we collect all that data, again, it's an annual cycle. That data drives the forecast that will be developed for future years as we plan fisheries. Next slide. So tonight we're focused on a really small geographic area within this map. We're focused on Puget Sound and the inside waters of Puget Sound, WDFW, and the Western Washington Treaty Tribes co-managed fisheries. There's similar processes that are going on the coast of Washington and the Columbia River. All of that kind of falls under the umbrella of what we call north of Falcon. And north of Falcon refers to an area off the point off the Oregon coast called Cape Falcon. You can see it here on this map. And the forum where we plan and manage our Washington fisheries, we refer to as north of Cape Falcon. As we move off into the federal ocean waters off the coast, there's another organization, the Pacific Fishery Management Council, that's responsible for planning fisheries in those waters. And we also have an international process, the Pacific Salmon Commission, that was formed under the Pacific Salmon Treaty of 1985. We work with Canadian and Alaskan governments to plan fisheries, and we have agreements in that treaty that specify limits on impact we can have on Canadian stocks as well as our own stocks. It's not a planning body as much as the preseason for the North of Falcon process, but we have to plan all of our fisheries to be consistent with the requirements of that Pacific Salmon Treaty. One of the things I mentioned that really drives our forecast each year are environmental factors, and I have the honor of passing it off now to Dr. Marisa Litz, who is going to talk to you about the ocean outlook for our salmon this year.
Thanks, Kyle. And so I'm just going to provide some context, both in terms of the atmosphere and the oceanographic conditions that were impacting salmon in 2023 and looking forward into 2024. So my next slide is a talk over outline. So I'm going to really briefly go over an update on some of the physical conditions. So temperature, the El Nino we're currently experiencing, marine heat waves. I'm going to talk about some notable biological observations, mostly in the ocean, and then the NOAA environmental indicators, also known as the ecosystem salmon stocklight chart. And take-home messages from just this short presentation is that climate variability is going to continue to impact salmon returns in 2024, and that the stressors affect both the freshwater and the marine life history stages of salmon. And then the current El Nino that we are in, it's still unknown the effect that this is going to have, but we'll have more resolution as we get into the spring. So next slide. So just want to couch this presentation acknowledging that 2023 experienced the warmest land and ocean surface temperatures on record, going back to 1850. And this means really two things. It means we're really in a place in the climate where we've never been before. And it also means that it's becoming more challenging for scientists to use past observations to predict what's coming next. Next slide. And we're currently in an El Nino, and forecasters are anticipating that this could reach historically strong levels, one of the strongest El Ninos going back to 1950s. But the good news is that these impacts may be short-lived. And just a reminder, so this plot is sea surface temperature anomalies, so deviations from the average. So redder colors are warmer than average, darker colors are cooler than average. but El Nino starts at the equator. And this is important because it really affects atmospheric circulation around the equator, and it can affect weather patterns globally, but it really is an equator phenomenon. And usually how we see those effects in the Pacific Northwest are disruptions to atmospheric rivers and weather patterns, but also through the movement of warm surface ocean northward into our region. Next slide. And we're coming off, interestingly enough, we're in an El Nino currently, but we're coming off 3 cycles of La Niñas that started in August 2020. And La Niñas are the opposite of El Nino. They tend to bring cooler, wetter conditions into the Pacific Northwest, and it's cooler at the equator. And this tends to be really good for Pacific Northwest salmon, whereas the El Nino tends to be bad for Northwest salmon. Next slide. And then we also know that multiple El Niños, so up to 5 per century, can really cause ecosystem tipping points that can harm fish. So this plot here just shows various cycles, more positive the El Niños and more negative of the La Niña cycles, strong ones over the past few decades. And you can see the last really large El Nino we had was 2015 and 2016. And then since then, we've been really oscillating, switching back and forth from El Nino and La Nina phenomenon. And the last 3 years prior to this year, we had this 3-peat La Nina, so something that's typically beneficial for Pacific Northwest salmon. And then we transitioned right away into this historically strong El Nino that we're still in. Next slide, please. And the forecasters from NOAA are predicting that this El Nino will actually be fairly short-lived, and it will end so that will fall below the 0.5 sea surface temperature anomaly at the equator. They're anticipating this will happen in the springtime between April and June. And not only that, but the predictions as that El Nino is, we're getting more and more confident that it's going to be decreasing in strength, that we're going to transition and phase right into another La Nina by August. Next slide. So El Nino, I mentioned it's an equator phenomenon, but there were also atmospheric and oceanographic things that are happening in the Pacific Northwest and in the North Pacific and the Gulf of Alaska, where salmon are feeding and growing prior to returning to their natal streams in Puget Sound. And one of these things is the warm blob. So the warm blob sets up when there's a ridge of high pressure. It parks itself over the North Pacific, and there's really little storm activity. Surface waters heat up. There's not a lot of overturn of those surface waters, bringing nutrients to the surface and fueling a lot of the phytoplankton and zooplankton that feeds the trophic web. And in 2014, 2015, many people were aware of this large phenomenon of the blob because it was combined with an El Nino, and it led to really dramatic declines in the returns of salmon, the size of salmon that returned, and the fecundity. It was a pretty dramatic and devastating. And we've been slowly recovering from that event. But it's also important to recognize that blob events really are happening annually, and they can be tracked and compared in terms of their size and their duration. So each year we are having these blob effects. And most recently in 2023, the blob looked very similar to the blob that occurred in 2014, right before that El Nino. But next slide, the good news is that with all this recent storm activity and cool weather, most of that warm surface water has dissipated. So there really isn't a current heat wave. So what you do see coming up from the south is a little bit of that warm water. So those little patches of red that could be related to the El Nino and deeper thermocline Kelvin waves that are bringing that equatorial warm water north and bringing with it kind of a suite of subtropical and tropical species. Next slide. So not only are marine factors of impacting fish, but we also know that the weather patterns are also impact our river systems. And we know we were worried at the end of 2023 as salmon were making their spawning migration that it was we were in a drought in many parts of the state, and we were desperately in need of some rain. And so as January started, we were about 50% of normal in terms of our snowpack across the state. Now, within 1 week, that really shifted to being 75, 80% of normal. And that position has really maintained itself through now. I know it feels like we've had more precipitation than we like, but we're creeping up to be more average, 100% of normal. Next slide. And the outlook over the next month, as a result of us still being in this El Nino, is that we are expected to have warmer than average temperatures and below average precipitation. Next slide, please. And as a result of some of these biological responses to the warming ocean over the last 3 years, one of the things that anglers particularly have noted is that we've seen this impact or this incidence of more subtropical and tropical species coming up into our marine waters. So things like opah caught off of seaside, tropical fishes like short-bill spearfish, bluefin tuna washing up on Orcas Island. And in fact, we even had a 21-pound mahi-mahi caught off Washington that broke the state record this year. Other things that we've been noting is the European green crab is invading into parts of Southeast Alaska, as well as Hood Canal. And we're seeing as subtropical and tropical fish come up from the south, we're also seeing salmon spawning farther and farther north into the Arctic, where they're considered an invasive species. Next slide. And so NOAA, each year, they produce this salmon indicator stoplight chart. It's a red light, green light color coding, which is, fairly intuitive. So green is good, red is bad. Each year corresponds in each column to a year that out-migrating smolts hit the ocean. And each column is a particular indicator. And see, these are either really large-scale atmospheric or oceanographic indicators that talk about El Nino or temperature. There's more local factors, and then there's also biological factors. So the prey of salmon or the prey of salmon. And you can see through 2015 through 2017, a lot of red, those terrible years for salmon. But the last 3 years, 21 through 23, we've seen a lot more green and yellow. And in fact, this last year was ranked 11 out of the 26 years. So a very average to good year. And the last slide, please. So just to conclude, so the ocean conditions were really favorable for smolts from 2021 through 2023. And in fact, things like sea surface temperature were some of the best of the 26-year time series. The biological indicators were just average in 2023. But the good news is that the El Nino signals, so sort of really warm sea surface temperatures, a lot of the, die-offs and blob signals have not yet reached Puget Sound. And the transition to El Nino Southern Oscillation neutral by spring, and not only that, but a transition to La Nina by the summer could really limit any negative consequences that the El Nino may have going into 2024. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Kyle and the rest of the team.
I hit the mute button because my dogs were excited running around upstairs because my wife got home. Thanks, Marisa. I'm going to walk you through a few slides now. The first are going to provide just kind of an overview of mixed stock fisheries. You've heard that term used a couple of times already. Explain what we're talking about when we say mixed stock fisheries. And then going to give a brief update on the Puget Sound Chinook Harvest Management Plan and the Stillaguamish payback provision within that plan. Next slide. So this is just a map of our marine catch record card areas for salmon around Washington. These have been around for a long time, and they're divide the marine waters up into 13 or so areas. Areas out on the Pacific Ocean start with Area 1 down around Ilwaco, and that's off the mouth of the Columbia River. It actually spans over into Oregon waters all the way down to Cape Falcon, which the point I mentioned earlier. And they walk 1, 2, 3, 4 up the coast to Nia Bay, the most northern of the ocean areas. Nia Bay goes all the way up to the US-Canada border. So obviously the white at the top of the map are Canadian waters, and then Vancouver Island north of that. We're here tonight to talk more about the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Puget Sound. So walking into the Strait of Juan de Fuca with Marine Area 5 off CQ, Marine Area 6, which extends from west of Port Angeles all the way over to the west shore of Whidbey Island. Marine Area 7 is the area around the San Juan Islands and up to Point Roberts and the Canadian border up there. Then the Area 8 is divided into two areas, 8-1 and 8-2, with 8-1 being the area of Skagit Bay and Deception Pass, and Area 8-2 being the Everett area, Port Susan and Port Gardner. Marine Area 9 is the Admiralty Inlet area. It covers a pretty big area from that western tip of Whidbey Island all the way down to the border with the Area 10, as well as up to the border with the Everett area. Marine Area 10 is the area between Seattle and Bremerton. Marine Area 11 is the Tacoma-Vashon Island area. Marine Area 12 is Hood Canal, and that's all waters south of the Hood Canal Bridge. And finally, Marine Area 13, or South Puget Sound, is all waters south of the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. All of our salmon fisheries in these waters are mixed stock fisheries, meaning that as we go fish for any species of salmon, we're encountering and catching fish that are headed for river systems throughout Puget Sound, for systems in Canada, for systems on the Washington coast, for systems on the Columbia River. So it's really complicated to plan these fisheries because we're not only encountering fish that are headed for a single river. In Puget Sound, we have 15 management units with multiple populations in some of those management units of Chinook salmon returning for the river. So we have to plan our fisheries to limit the impacts on all of those populations. And there's a great deal of uncertainty connected to that. Next slide. So this is a super simplified example, but to try to put things in perspective, if we have a run of 100 fish that's returned for some river in Puget Sound, they're protected by the Endangered Species Act. They're listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, but we have to limit our impact of those on those. Next slide. So, and this is just an example, but we might have to pass 90 of that 100 fish or 90% onto the spawning grounds to escape and spawn naturally. That leaves 10 fish or 10% that we can either harvest or have as incidental mortalities in our fisheries. Next slide. Those 10 fish have to be split up between state and tribal fisheries. So 5 of those might go to state fisheries and 5 of those might go to tribal fisheries. Next slide. Those 5 fish don't swim in a nice protected bubble together and move through Puget Sound in some predictable way. They're mixed up with all of the other wild stocks in Puget Sound, as well as all the hatchery fish that we're actually trying to harvest in our fisheries. So it's very, very hard to estimate what our impacts on each of those stocks are, but critical to us, critical that we do that to limit our impacts to the ESA stocks. And the last slide. So again, we're trying to avoid that one relatively rare wild fish from one population in Puget Sound while we harvest all of the hatchery fish and other species of salmon that we're targeting as we move through Puget Sound. And those poor status stocks being encountered in these mixed stock fisheries are typically what limits our opportunity in those mixed stock fisheries, even though we're trying to harvest those more abundant stocks in hatchery fish. Next slide. I mentioned that Puget Sound Chinook salmon are listed under the Endangered Species Act as threatened, and that means that we need federal authorization for any activity that takes those fish. And under the ESA, take means to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. So when we implement fisheries in Puget Sound that are encountering these listed Puget Sound Chinook, we need ESA authorization from the federal government to do that. For a number of years, the Puget Sound co-managers have had to seek 1-year ESA authorization for our fisheries in Puget Sound marine and freshwater areas. In 2022, the co-managers submitted a long-term fishery management plan seeking ESA authorization for 10 years for our Puget Sound fisheries. This plan sets limits on the annual allowable impact levels, or take, for individual population of ESA-listed Chinook. And there are population-specific impact levels within that plan, and those levels are variable depending on the abundance of adult Chinook returning to individual populations each year. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the federal agency with responsibility, ESA responsibility for Pacific salmon, is conducting their review process for the co-manager plan. and expects to have it done prior to the start of 2025 fisheries in May of next year. That means that we'll have to have another 1-year authorization for 2024 fisheries, which we're about to start planning, that begin in May of this year. NOAA expects to have their draft environmental impact statement out for public comment this summer, as well as their draft companion ESA review. Then they have to review those comments and prepare their final decision subsequent to that. But again, that process is ongoing, and we hope by next year we'll have a long-term fishery management plan for our Puget Sound fisheries in place. Next slide. One new feature of the management plan submitted in 2022 is what we call the Stillaguamish payback provision. It's something that was developed focused on one of the most critical low abundant stocks we have in Puget Sound, Stillaguamish Chinook. And its purpose is to ensure that fisheries are implemented consistent with the management strategy that we develop through North of Falcon and describe each year in the list of agreed fisheries. So part of our annual process is we develop what's called a list of agreed fisheries with the Puget Sound tribes. And it's really just a 1-year fishing plan outlining what the state and tribal fisheries for the upcoming year will look like. We then need to implement our fisheries to make sure we stay within the limits that we intended when we designed that list of agreed fisheries. So each year we'll evaluate non-tribal and tribal fisheries in Puget Sound that have a measurable impact on Stillaguamish Chinook. And we'll calculate an aggregate in-season estimated mortality on Stillaguamish Chinook and compare that to what we planned in the preseason using our fishery planning models for all the non-tribal fisheries in Washington and for all the tribal fisheries in Washington. The review period's off a little bit from our fishery planning year because as we start to plan fisheries, we still have some ongoing. So for 2024, we'll be looking at the winter of 22-2023, so fisheries that went through April of 2023, plus summer fall fisheries in 2023. And if we see that the estimated in-season Stillaguamish mortalities are greater than what we predicted preseason, then we will reduce our impact on Stillaguamish mortalities in the upcoming season by that total overage. And this will be done for state and tribal fisheries separately. And it's what we call a conservation payback. So if we exceeded our allowable impact, we'll reduce our impact in that future year, but those fish will go unharvested. They won't be used by anyone else in fisheries. The plan says that we'll evaluate that payback by about February 7th of each year. And that's going to happen in the next week or so. And this will be the first year that we've implemented that payback provision. So a lot of people have asked questions about that and where we are in the development. We just about have it developed and are about to do that review and look at that first year of 2024. With that, all this will be done in the framework of our fishery model. Our FRAM model that Derek's going to talk about next is our critical tool for developing our Chinook fisheries as well as our coho fisheries each year. It's also the assessment tool we use to go back and look and see how we did compared to what we planned preseason on these stocks. And with that, I will pass it off to Dr. Derek Dapp, our FRAM modeling lead.
Thank you for that introduction, Kyle. Hello, everybody. Today, I'm going to speak a little bit to the preseason modeling process. By the end of my section, I'm hoping that folks will have an understanding of some of the key terms that we use in the modeling, how we evaluate modeling inputs against management objectives, and some of the challenges that we're likely to face in 2024 preseason for Chinook. So next slide, please. To start off, let's talk a little bit about the Fishery Regulation Assessment Model, also referred to as FRAM, as Kyle was mentioning. FRAM is a tool that we use to parse mixed stock fishery impacts into stock age components. FRAM can be used to evaluate fisheries in a given year and see if they're compliant with management objectives. For anybody who might be interested in more information on FRAM after we get through this presentation, note that there's a link to the model's documentation and code on screen now. Next slide, please. So FRAM is used for both preseason and postseason assessment of fishery impacts on stocks. In the preseason, we're using forecast abundances and anticipated fishery catches for the coming year to plan fisheries that meet management objectives. In the postseason, we're using actual catch estimates of salmon and also actual estimates of salmon returns to evaluate how fisheries that occurred impacted stocks in the model. In both evaluation exercises, that is the preseason and postseason, FRAM calculates salmon mortality for both landed and released encounters. FRAM also examines escapement, and through the combination of those things, we can estimate exploitation rates. We'll explore what exploitation rates are in coming slides, but I should note that that FRAM is only used for Chinook and coho. Next slide, please. Thank you. Prior to diving into the modeling, I think it's really important to define a few key terms. And first on screen here is our first term, which is adult equivalent or AEQ mortalities. An adult equivalent rate is applied to Chinook only. It's not applied to coho. And it represents the likelihood of a fish from a particular stock and at an age of returning to the river. And at an age of returning to the river as an adult if it's not killed in a fishery. To calculate this, adult equivalence takes into account both natural mortality and maturation rates. I guess one thing that I commonly hear confused is that one AEQ mortality represents an escapement change in the coming year by one fish. However, that's not actually how it works. What it actually represents is that one AEQ mortality represents an escapement change of one fish at some point throughout the fish's life cycle. So for example, you can imagine that for some stock at age 2, if the modeling were to assign a stock an AEQ rate of 50%, if fishing doesn't occur, then there's a 50% chance that that fish will return to the river. However, because that fish that we're using in this example is an H2, it may return to that river in that year as an H2, but it's more likely to return potentially as an H3, 4, or 5 in future years. Next slide, please. It was important to define what an adult equivalence was in the last slide because it's the metric that we use to develop exploitation rate estimates. An exploitation rate represents the percentage of the adult equivalent population taken by a fishery or by a grouping of fisheries. And I should mention that most management objectives for both Chinook and coho are defined in terms of exploitation rate. And once again, exploitation rates are stock specific. The equation for an exploitation rate, you can see kind of at the bottom of the right of the screen here, and it's simply the number of adult equivalent mortalities from either a fishery or a grouping of fisheries divided by the adult equivalent mortalities of all fisheries plus escapement. So in this case, the denominator represents adult abundance. Maybe to walk through a fictitious example, imagine that for a particular stock, there was an escapement of 100 fish, and I'm looking at the table to the right now. Imagine that fisheries along the West Coast impacted the stock, and we estimate that there was 10 AEQ mortalities occurring in Alaska, 10 in British Columbia, 10 in Washington, 10 in Oregon, and 10 in California. So if we were calculating a total exploitation rate, that is the exploitation rate for all fisheries along the West Coast, we would get 50 AEQ mortalities as a numerator, and then for the denominator, we would get 50 AEQ mortalities added to 100 fish in escapement. This would result in 50 over 150, or a total exploitation rate of 33%. We could similarly calculate an SUS, or Southern US exploitation rate, and that metric would include fishery mortalities only from Washington, Oregon, and California. Basically, a Southern US rate represents anything south of Canada. So it would be 30 AEQ mortalities divided by the total adult population of 150, or in this case, a Southern US exploitation rate of 20%. Next slide, please. So I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd, and so a lot of you probably have some experience with what a management objective is. However, for folks who are new on the call today, I'm going to use Dungeness Chinook as an example for management objectives. Many stocks have a low abundance threshold, also referred to as an LAT, and as the abundance of the stock changes, so too does the allowable exploitation rate. In the case of Dungeness, the low abundance threshold is 500 fish in escapement. So if the stock abundance is greater than 500 fish in escapement, then fisheries are managed to an exploitation rate limit of 10% in the southern US. However, if that escapement falls below 500 fish, then fisheries must be managed for a critical exploitation rate of 6% in the southern US. This one's a relatively simplistic stock example, with some stocks having multiple tiers of abundance threshold and therefore exploitation rate objectives. Next slide, please. On screen now, you'll see what the Chinook management objectives were for the 2023 preseason planning process. The exploitation rate metric used, as you can see, varies across stocks and at different abundances. However, highlighted in green here is the Stillaguamish River, which has been kind of our primary constraining stock for sport fisheries in Puget Sound for the last 5 years. We've also highlighted a few other stocks that have been occasionally constraining in the last 5 years in blue. Maybe going down the list, Nooksack Springs, Skagit Summer Falls, Skagit Springs, Snohomish, Nisqually, Skokomish, and Midhood Canal. Next slide. So we don't know what the management objectives for Chinook and Coho will be in 2024 because they're dependent upon regional abundance forecasts. That forecast processing is occurring now, and we hope to have management objectives identified in the next month or so. However, we did really want to highlight one trend that we've observed in the past few years for Chinook fisheries, which is that Chinook catches per day that the fishery is open for have really increased in recent years, and particularly when we look at some areas. It's really great to see increasing rates of angler success and participation, but it's likely that many of our Chinook management objectives for 2024 will be similar to those in 2023. And that means that they're going to, if there are similar exploitation rate objectives during fishery planning, and then we would need more impacts to have longer seasons, those greater impacts might not be available. So to demonstrate kind of this issue that we're running into, on screen here, we're going to look at Marine Area 5 in the winter, which Marine Area 5 is situated between CQ River and Lyre River as an example. Next slide. So on screen here, you see until about 2016, there was a trend where Area 5 winter Chinook fisheries would be open for approximately 70 to 85 days. Typically during that period, they'd catch less than 500 Chinook. Last year, the fishery was open for just 10 days and caught over 1,300 Chinook. Where this was historically a pretty small fishery, factors such as angler success, angler participation, and effort shifts from closed areas have really contributed to a much higher modeled impact needed to run some of the same seasons that we might have seen historically. Next slide, please. And even though Area 5 winter is a good example, you can see that here, I believe it's in the green line. There are several other examples where you could see this trend throughout Puget Sound. For example, if we're looking at Area 11 in June, which is represented in red here, you can see how that catch per day pattern. Area 11, just for reference, is the Tacoma area. And we could also look at Area 7 in the summertime. That's this blue line here, which represents the San Juan area. In all three of these fisheries, the impacts that you might need to model a season are very different in recent years than we've seen historically. Next slide, please. So given the limited impacts that we've got available and the recent catch trends, our aim is to really maximize fishing opportunity while meeting conservation objectives. We go through the pre-season planning process, working with the public to consider recreational priorities and examine trade-offs with certain management areas. Typically, this is done via scenario modeling tools for Chinook and Coho in each area. And we host these tools online during public meetings so that the public can work with us to develop fishing scenarios. An example from last year, you can see in the table below where WDFW examined how different changes to Marine Area 5 in the summer would potentially affect predicted Stillaguamish mortalities. I won't walk through what all that scenario modeling process looks like just now, but we will be developing and exploring those scenarios together in future North of Falcon meetings. And if you're interested, please get involved and attend those. With that, I'll be handing the virtual mic to Dr. Kirsten Simonson, who's our Puget Sound Recreational Salmon Manager.
Thanks so much, Derek. I'm going to walk through some of the season recap and some of the key areas from last year. So with that, I'll jump right into it if we can go to the next slide. So the main areas that I'm going to talk about today are Marine Areas 7, 9, and 11. These are the ones that tend to garner the most questions and the most interest, and so just wanted to walk through these. Just to kind of orient everyone first, though, Areas 7 and 9, because of the way that they were, the seasons were run this last year or two with these kind of short week openers that we've had, the data for Chinook fisheries are displayed as a harvest per day. So it's the number of legal marked Chinook that were caught per day that the fishery was open over that time frame. In contrast, Coho and pink fisheries are displayed as CPUE, or catch per unit effort. And CPUE is kind of a really typical term that we use in fisheries management, and it basically describes the amount of catch per some unit of effort. And in this case, the unit of effort is basically one angler on a trip per day. So it's basically the number of fish caught per angler on any given day that the fishery is open. And I'll show you what this looks like in a second. So for areas 10 and 11, though, because those were more of a full season, or we tried to make them a full season, all that data is displayed as CPUE. So if we want to go to the next, click forward. So this is kind of what a typical CPUE figure looks like here. And just to kind of orient you a little bit to what we're looking at here, you can see that on the x-axis here, or the horizontal axis, we have the date. that a fishery was open. And then on the Y or the vertical axis, you see the CPUE, and you see there's a range of values here, and you can kind of see these numbers jumping around. So we want to click forward. So we can see here that this red line represents the current, which is the 2023 data. So it's usually the year that we're looking at. So this is the current data for CPUE for any given fishery. And then this blue line here is the historic average. And when we say historic average, this is basically the previous 5 years that this fishery has been open. And for a pink fishery, when we're displaying that, it's just the previous odd years. So just the pink years that the fishery was around. And then you can see that this is kind of a smooth trend, and you can kind of see what the red line looks like, and you can see that the blue line kind of mirrors that to some degree, looking at this kind of smooth trend there, and the gray shading around that represents some of the little bit of the uncertainty in that estimate around that smoothing trend for those years. So if we click forward again, you can see that anytime that red line is above the blue line, that's basically representing a catch that's kind of above the historical average. And if we click forward again, anything that's below that line is a catch that's typically below average. So that's just to kind of orient you as we're moving through these next couple of slides. You're going to see the same type of figure over and over again. So I just wanted to kind of walk through it slowly for those who are not familiar with seeing these. So we can go to the next slide. And we're going to start with Chinook catch in Area 7. So this is the San Juan Islands. Again, I'm showing this by the harvest per day. So you can see the days that the fishery was open here on the x-axis. And you can see that there was really high catch the opening day. And then that catch kind of dropped off to the next weekends that we did have that fishery open. This season was planned for just that one short weekend opener from July 13th through 15th. We took a lot of in-season management actions during this, and we were able to kind of monitor this very closely and able to open it for a couple more days in the following 2 weekends. So it was open on the 21st and then again the 28th and 29th. At that point, we had pretty much reached our harvest quota and our sublegal encounters limit. You can see in this table here the fishery controls that existed for this fishery. And you could see that we hit 96% of our harvest quota for this fishery and went just over our sublegal encounters, 106% for this fishery by the time that it closed down on the 29th. Next slide, please. So this is Area 7, both the pink and the coho fisheries. Again, this is that CPUE slide that I just kind of walked through. So we could see that for pink fisheries in Area 7, we had much higher CPUE than we have seen historically. This was a pretty great pink year for anybody who was out there able to take advantage of that. We saw really high catches, really high numbers of pinks in Puget Sound, kind of throughout Puget Sound for this season. And then you can see the graph on the right shows the coho fishery. And again, you can see above average coho CPUE for this fishery in Area 7 during this year. That coho fishery was a mark selected fishery during the time that Chinook fishing was open, or Chinook retention was open. And then it was a mark selected fishery for the month of August. And then that switched to a non-selected fishery for the month of September. And another thing to point out is that based on the number of pinks that we saw moving into Puget Sound this year, we were able to add 2 additional pinks to that Area 7 fishery beginning on August 19th. So next slide, please. We're going to move into Area 9, which is the Admiralty Inlet area. Again, you'll see the Chinook harvest here displayed as a harvest per day. Again, you could see really high numbers for that initial opening weekend and then kind of dropping off after that. Did not drop off quite as precipitously as it did in Area 7, which is kind of consistent with what we saw last year when we had a very similar planned fishery. Or sorry, in 2022, I keep saying last year as if it's still 23, and it is not. I got to remind myself of that. So this fishery was planned again for that July 13th through 31st for Thursdays through Saturdays only. The actual season was those 2 initial 3-day openers, and then we were able to get 2 days out of that third weekend. Did close down 1 day early on the 29th, and that's because we did reach over our harvest quota of 106% that you can see in this table that's here on the bottom. So if we move to the next slide, we'll again and walk through the pink and coho fisheries in Area 9. Again, the pink fishery, you can see that CPUE on the left-hand side. So you can see above average catch, above average CPUE for that fishery throughout the season. And then for coho, again, you could see this kind of ramped up throughout this as the season went on. And we ended up having pretty much above average CPUE for that entire season as well. For coho fisheries, this was marked selective for most of the season while Chinook retention was open, and then through the beginning part of September. And it did become non-selective for the end half of September, from the 18th through the 30th, and then it closed down after the 30th of September as was planned. So if we move to the next slide, we're going to kind of keep walking our way down through Puget Sound. So this is looking at the Chinook catch in Area 10, which is the Seattle-Bremerton area. This fishery was planned from July 13th through the end of August. We did kind of have some back and forth with this one. I'm sure there'll be some questions on this, which I can definitely answer later on. The actual season lasted from July 13th through the beginning part of August, closed down. We continued to do test fishing in this area and realized that we had a pretty big push of legal marked fish that came in around that same time period. So that dropped our encounter rate. So we were able to open back up again for the weekends of August 11th through 13th. And then from August 18th through 20th again, at which point both our harvest quota and our sublegal encounter rates, our limits for this fishery were reached. So the CPUE figure here looks a little bit funky just because you see those drops, and that was the time frame that this fishery was closed down in those couple weeks of August. So next slide, please. So I'm going to come back to pink in a second, but first I'm going to walk through Area 10 coho. So this is the figure for coho CPUE in Area 10 this summer. And you can see again, well above average CPUE for this fishery, almost 2 fish per angler for a little while there. This is an area that is non-selective for coho. It was open through the end of October. And we did go down to a 1 coho limit in early August just due to high catch totals for this area. And I will kind of come back to this in a little bit. We did manage to get back to a 2 coho limit in September based on kind of looking and assessing this fishery as we went on. And you can see kind of where that CPUE spikes back up again is when it went back to 2 coho in September. So going to the next slide, please. So this is looking at the pink fisheries for both Area 10 and Area 11 now side by side. They were really similar for this year. We had, again, above average CPUE for both of these fisheries. You can see Area 10 on the left and Area 11 on the right. And we did have traditional pinks added to this quota as of the beginning part of September on September 8th. And so, yeah, again, this was just kind of very typical of this really big run of pinks that we saw in Puget Sound this year. So moving to the next slide. We're going to walk through the Area 11 Chinook season. This one is one that I did not put the CPUE figure up. It did not make a whole lot of sense based on the kind of short openings that we had for this fishery this year. But we can kind of walk through some of the numbers. So we did have kind of 2 separate seasons modeled for this for the period of time for June, and then from July basically through when the fishery was planned through at the end of September. And this is basically due to the difference in the stocks that are modeled for in this area at these times. So there's different stock composition based on the modeling that we have and coded wire tag recoveries for the portion of time in June and the portion from July through September. So that's why these are modeled as 2 separate seasons with 2 separate quotas. So we could see that the June timeframe, we did go over our unmarked encounters, which was the wild fish. We did go over that encounter limit in early June. So that fishery was open from June 1st through 4th, and then the 8th through the 11th, and then it closed down after June 15th. And then in July, we had a really similar story where we had reached both of our sublegal encounter and our unmarked or wild encounter limits halfway through the fishery as well. So it was open from July 1st to 2nd, and then again from the 6th to the 9th, the 13th and the 14th, and then again closed down on July 15th. So this is one that I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a little while. I know there'll probably be some questions about this as well. So promise I'll get to that. So if we want to go to the next slide, please. So this is looking at the Area 11 coho fishery now. So we can look at the CPUE plot for this. Again, you can see those areas of above average CPUE for this fishery for the entire season. So the one thing that I do want to point out here is that the preseason modeling for this fishery did not include Chinook non-retention impacts until September. So that's something that's necessary to have if we do anticipate having a fishery that closes to Chinook early. We have non-retention impacts that are built in. For this fishery, we did not have those until September. And so due to that high impact on wild Chinook, those unmarked Chinook that I showed in the last slide, we were unable to have this fishery open in the marine areas during that planned pink and coho fishery time period in August. And for that reason, we decided to go to a shore-based only, knowing that there's very few Chinook impacts when we have a shore-based only fishery. And then once we had those non-retention impacts back into the fishery, we reopened the marine area on the 1st of September. This is an area where coho is non-selective for this fishery. And again, it was open then from when it reopened in the marine area on the 1st of September, it was open through the end of October. So we want to go to the next slide. So like I said, I wanted to talk through some of these the coho in-season management actions that were taken this year. Usually coho is not a fishery that we intensively manage in season and have fishery controls on, just because coho are not ESA listed like Chinook are. So for that reason, we typically don't take a whole lot of in-season management action on them. However, that's not to say that we don't have to be accountable for the numbers of coho that we are catching in these fisheries. So here I wanted to show a couple of things here. So this is some estimates of the July catches for 3 different fisheries. So we have Area 9, Area 10, and Area 11, all in July. And you can see the numbers that we're looking at here, were the preseason predicted numbers for both retained and total encounters. In Area 9, what was the preseason prediction of catch, and the actual estimate was over 350% of the retained and over 260% of the total encounters. For Area 10, that number was over 260% of the retained and over 175% of the total encounters. And Area 11 was again over 170% of the retained fish and then over 100% of the total encounters. So one of the questions that we've gotten as the season went on was, why were there actions that were taken in Area 10 and not in other areas? And so there's really 2 reasons for this. One of them is just the magnitude of the catch that we saw in Area 10. You can see that, yes, it was not, the percentage was not as high as, say, Area 9, but just the sheer number of fish that were caught in this area, it was over 12,000 fish, which was over 8,000 more fish than we anticipated seeing in this fishery. And so that was one of the reasons. The other reason that in-season management actions were taken in this fishery was that there was concerns over certain coho stocks of concern that were limiting for the fisheries this year. And some of those stocks are found in high numbers based on our modeling of code-wire tag returns in this area. So based on just the sheer number of fish that were caught and the stocks of concern that we were potentially impacting, we made the decision to go down to that 1 coho limit. And then once we kind of stabilized, we were able to bump it back up to 2 coho limit in this area. So, and then we want to go to the next slide. So this is, kind of a story of looking at coho-directed fisheries and Chinook impacts during these fisheries. So the other thing that I want to point out with some of these is that, it's still important for us to be accounting for catch and release impacts of Chinook during these pink and coho-directed fisheries. So additional intensive monitoring has been implemented since 2020 because of this. So during these coho fisheries, we are doing intensive monitoring to assess any potential Chinook impacts. And this is because any salmon-directed fishery that we have has the potential to impact our conservation goals on some of these key stocks. So that's just kind of a brief overview of what we had going on this past season. And with that, I'm going to kind of move it looking forward. So if we want to go to the next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Mark Baltzell, who is our statewide salmon and steelhead manager, and we're going to kind of walk through some of the things we're expecting looking forward in the next season.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I realize we've been talking for almost an hour now, and it's a lot of information to digest. I am the last formal speaker this evening, so I'll try to keep my comments brief and on target. I'm going to talk a little bit here about kind of the outlook for 2024. Talk through a little bit about in-season management and the list of agreed fisheries. I'm going to talk through some of our recent year recreational priorities that we've considered as we've implemented seasons this year. I'm going to touch on some trends that we've been seeing in the data with regards to recreational fisheries, particularly directed at Chinook. And then I'm going to just do some high level talking about some of the trends in the data and some of the other challenges that we have for implementing recreational fisheries. So next slide, Haley. So folks who are new to the process and thinking ahead, really, it's really hard for us to say we really know what to expect until we get the forecasts for the upcoming year. So as has been mentioned previously in this discussion, those are being worked on currently. We expect to finalize those with our co-managers here by the middle of February and have those out during our forecast presentation early in March. I think it's fair to say that as we're looking at the landscape, Stillaguamish Chinook will continue to restrict marine area fishing opportunities as they have been in the most recent, 5 to 6 year period. As Kirsten mentioned and others, it's an even year, so no pink salmon as part of our salmon planning this year. And really just, I think folks should expect that we're going to approach these fisheries with the same kind of level of consideration that we have in the past. We have a recently adopted North of Falcon policy that has gone through the commission process that really provides a guide for us, an additional guide besides all of our conservation and recovery goals. That policy helps guide us in regards to fishing opportunities and how we just try to provide a diverse and balanced suite of those fisheries. Next slide, please. So Kyle talked about it a little earlier. We have this document that we produce at the end of North of Falcon called the List of Agreed Fisheries. It's really a big document that talks through all of the planned fishery dates and seasons for both the tribal co-managers and the state fisheries from the coast and in Puget Sound and in all the freshwater systems. Within that document, there's a lot of appendices that are in there, some in-season management, test fishing plans, other agreed to monitoring plans for the state. You'll often find our fishery controls in there that we developed through the North of Falcon process. So I wanted to make sure folks were aware that that document exists. It is available for public consumption approximately 7 to 10 days after we finalize our preseason fisheries after the second Pacific Fishery Management Council meeting in early April. Another thing, there are occasions where fisheries that are planned in the LOF that there are deviations from those planned fisheries. Often that comes with kind of either preseason or in-season agreements based on in-season update tools. And just for folks' awareness, we do communicate throughout the fishing year and the non-fishing parts of the year with our co-managers, collaborating on all aspects of these fishery management plans and the evaluation of these fisheries. Next slide, please. So since 2018, we have seen some big changes in our marine area fisheries, particularly targeting Chinook. We updated the FRAM model that Derek talked about earlier with an updated base period of years with those coded wire tags. And through that modeling and subsequent agreement on management objectives, we noticed that the landscape was a little different than how we had been looking at it in the past. And I think one aspect of this that I wanted to get across is that not all these marine areas are the same in terms of impact on stocks of concern. Some areas like Area 7 have really high mortalities in the model on Stillaguamish. So in both the winter time period and the summer time period, those are really expensive fisheries in terms of impacts on Stillaguamish. our most limiting stock. So that is something that we take into consideration when we're trying to plan these fisheries in the preseason. Also, as we've struggled or had to shape these fisheries to meet these updated management objectives, and we knew that we had to make some tough choices on fishing opportunities, we heard from our angling public and through a number of North of Falcon processes that folks favored summer fishing opportunities directed at returning adults, as opposed to winter fisheries targeting blackmouth. As I said, there are a number of winter fisheries areas, traditional winter fisheries areas that were closed because of the lessened amount of impacts available to prosecute fisheries. I think we talked about this also, that in pink and coho seasons, there are non-retention release mortalities that are associated with those opportunities as well. The department has increased those monitoring efforts in those time periods and seasons to make sure that we're being fully accountable in our fisheries for those non-target mortalities. And again, I talked about this earlier, but really we've worked hard to balance these opportunities, to maximize catch when we can, to maximize fishing time on the water when we can, also provide for freshwater harvests, and really do it across a broad geographic area of the coast and Western Washington, and try to do that within our conservation limitations. Next slide, please. So what we have displayed here is taking the numbers that Derek and his team produce from the model, and we're looking at total Puget Sound recreational sport catch from 2014 to 2023. So I think the big takeaway that we wanted to present with this slide is if we're looking over a long period of time, the recreational catch in Puget Sound has remained relatively stable. You see that that spike there in around 2017 and 2018. And if you look at the table to the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see that that's South Puget Sound terminal run size. And really, that table there is just meant to inform a big contributing factor to that sport catch in 2017 and 2018. You'll also see that same spike in catch as we progress through the next couple of slides. But I do think it's important to note that in 2017, that South Sound hatchery run size was the second highest return since 1975. So I think it's worth noting that those fish are caught all through all of our fisheries. Next slide, please. So again, taking that previous slide as overall Puget Sound sport catch, and we're breaking that down now into smaller chunks by marine area. So on the left-hand side, you're going to see the Straits and San Juan Islands. So that's marine areas 5 in blue, 6 in red, and 7 in green. And on the right-hand side, you're going to see marine areas 8 in blue, 9 in red, and 12 in green. So back to the left-hand slide, I think, it obviously shows the big reductions that we've taken to the Area 7 opportunities in the recent years, maybe a small uptick in Area 6, and maybe a small downturn in Area 5. On the right-hand side, I think we would say, those Area 12 catches are relatively stable, and Area 9 and 8 have seen some reductions due to constraining stocks. Next slide. And finally, Mid and South Sound, with Area 10 being in blue, Area 11 being in orange, and Area 13 in gray. You can see those elevated catches in 10 and 11 in that 17-18 time period. But really, we've seen some increases in catch in both 10 and 13. So I think the take-home message there is that we've seen stable catches, and kind of the notion that those we're getting less fish kind of towards the recreational fishery is discounted a little bit as far as the preseason modeling. What we're really seeing is a redistribution of those catches from the past to kind of more recent. Next slide, please. So previously we were looking at preseason catches from the model. This slide shows us postseason marine sport catches. And on the graph, the solid line indicates a combined summer and winter Chinook sport catch in Puget Sound. And the dotted line represents the Puget Sound summer fall Chinook return. The preseason catches that we talked about are really important for the planning piece of what we do each year. These postseason catches are the actual estimated catches from each fishing season. And I think what we were just trying to show here is that it's pretty clear that our recreational catches are following the fall, summer fall run size in each of these years pretty closely. Next slide, please. So a couple slides here to wrap up, and I think this has been demonstrated by Derek a little while ago, but I think we wanted to just talk through a little bit more some of the challenges that we're seeing in the data and the trends within these fisheries. So what you're seeing on the screen here is 4 different marine areas, 7 in red, 9 in green, 10 in the teal blue color, and then 11 in the purple violet color. And really what we want to represent to you is the increasing catch per day in each of these areas that we're seeing in most recent years' trends. Next slide, please. And really just talking through some of that, I think we have seen these elevated trends of increasing effort and catchability in a lot of our marine areas. It's also pretty apparent to us that as we've moved forward in time from, you know, the 20 teens till now, we have a pretty socially tuned in, social media tuned in fishing fleet. There's a lot of information that gets passed back and forth freely through all sorts of different social media platforms. And we know that our recreational fleet is increasingly mobile, and we'll go where the opportunities exist, when they exist, and when the bite is on, they will go and try to get their opportunity before it closes. We know that as these opportunities decrease over time, that's going to concentrate this effort, and it causes the harvest and counter levels that we have to abide by for the conservation and recovery goals. It causes those to be met sooner than we plan in those preseason processes. And that's where the in-season management comes in. The irregularity in a lot of the recent year trends makes predictability and uncertainty in what we're trying to do in any given year that much harder. I can't get out of here with kind of touching on some of the things that Dr. Litz talked about. Climate change is going to continue, and we're going to have to make sure that we're capturing the effects of climate change in our decision-making processes, not just on salmon, but the other species that are adjacent to salmon. And I think really the biggest take-home message here for everybody is as frustrating as fisheries closures and restrictive management is, these are listed populations. They have been listed since 1999, and we are not making meaningful recovery. Fisheries will continue to be limited until we start to see improvement in these areas. So with that, I think we're going to bring a slide up to go through what's ahead here for our North of Falcon planning process. Not sure if I'm supposed to walk through it on here, but I'm happy to. Upcoming, we talked about in the end of February. We'll start off with Willapa Grace Harbor salmon forecast meeting. That's a virtual meeting. On Friday, March 1st, we're going to have our forecast kickoff. That's going to be a hybrid meeting. We're going to do that from OB building across from the Natural Resources building in Olympia. Times to be determined, but it'll probably be 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning. The first Pacific Fisheries Management Council meeting will be in Fresno this year, for those interested. That'll be in early March, and that's where we set ocean salmon fishing alternatives for Chinook and Coho. Our first public North of Falcon meeting will be Wednesday, March 13th, again back at the OB2 building across from the Natural Resources building in Olympia. It will be a hybrid meeting as well. We'll have a first recreational fisheries discussion with a Zoom meeting on Tuesday, March 19th. We'll have those ocean fishing levels and be able to start center in on what the constraints to our fishing opportunities are for Puget Sound this year. On March 21st, there'll be a public meeting around Columbia River fisheries. That will be a hybrid meeting as well and in person at the Ridgefield office. Again, second meeting in the same week for recreational fisheries, another Zoom meeting on Thursday, March 21st in the evening. Wednesday, March 27th, the next week, we'll have another North of Falcon 2 meeting. This will be in Linwood, Washington at the Linwood Embassy Suites. We will host that meeting. It will also be a hybrid meeting. Again, we will talk about fishery alternatives and planning for the upcoming season. March 28th will bring us to the Willapa and Grace Harbor Fisheries meeting. The second and final Pacific Fisheries Management Council meeting will be in Seattle this year at the Westin from April 6th to the 11th. And then we'll have a final proposed fisheries for Willapa and Grace Harbor shortly following the PFMC meeting on April 16th, which is a Tuesday. All this information is available on our website. And we will have any additional meeting and preseason info available there as you make your way through the preseason process. Again, thanks everybody for being here tonight. And I think I'm going to hand it back to Nate to head over to the Q&A portion of our evening. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks to all the presenters. I really appreciate the work that goes into compiling those PowerPoints and taking the time to present this information. So I think we're going to jump to the Q&A. I don't know if we have a slide again on just the Zoom mechanics, Leah, or if we want to just go straight into the questions here. Leah, thoughts?
I am not sure if there is another slide in the presentation, but I can give a verbal reminder for folks to raise your hand. It's going to be *9 if you're on your phone. If you're in person, there is a raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes it looks like a smiley face that says reactions, depending on the Zoom that you are using. And also there is, I will go through and unmute you, but if you're on the phone, you may need to hit *6 on your phone. Our first hand is from Gabe. Gabe, go ahead.
And Leah, just one other item. If we could take the PowerPoint down now and we'll go to Gabe's question. Thanks.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Got it. You guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right, thanks. What factors or metrics does the department use to inform their decision to use all the various fishery controls in each area of Puget Sound?
I guess maybe I'll take that one, and team, if I miss something or you need to add something, jump in. I really think great question, Gabe. I don't think that we have a specific set of metrics that we use. I think we take a look at the big picture as we're going through the preseason process, thinking about the constraining stocks and looking at the different marine areas and thinking about the level of risk that comes with exceeding any one of those metrics. Also, sometimes we put things in place because that's what it takes to get to agreement with our co-managers. So although there may not be definitive biological reasons why we put fishery controls in place, it's a necessary thing that we need to do to bring a level of comfort to our co-managers about our fisheries impacts in any one of our fishery. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Can you speak to what specific stock we were concerned about last June in Area 11, why we had an unmarked encounter fishery control there?
I don't know that I can speak to that specifically right now. I would want to go back, but I think in general, Gabe, as we're thinking about all this suite of fisheries, it goes back to that Stille payback provision that Kyle talked about earlier. I don't think that we want to be sitting here in a future town hall talking to you about how we're going to have little to no salmon fishing opportunity because we significantly exceeded a management objective that caused us to reduce our impact on Stillaguamish fish. I think that's the sort of Damocles that hangs over our head at any one given time. And I guess we're taking a precautionary approach, knowing the status of these stocks and knowing that the risks are great if we significantly exceed any one of these management objectives.
Okay, I understood. I want to push back a little bit though. The Stillaguamish, the June fishery in Area 11 has one of the lowest impacts on Stillaguamish stock in Puget Sound, and it's an important fishery at a time of year where there aren't many other fisheries open. And when looking through, AEQ charts and management objectives, I'm struggling to understand why there's an unmarked encounter fishery control in that fishery when, it's one of the least impactful on Stillaguamish.
Well, I'm not going to say anything new to you, Gabe. Again, I think I was pretty clear that sometimes these are about reaching an agreement. And although they may or may not make sense, we're sticking to our agreements and we're going to manage to the levels that we agreed to manage to.
Understood. Loud and clear. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Gabe. Just a note, we had a suggestion from one of our Puget Sound advisors that I really appreciate. And Leah, I'm ask you is, we want to try to take hands in order that they come up. And I know that we're getting some questions in the chat as well, so probably bounce back and forth. But I do know that there's an advisory group meeting coming up here later this week. And so we might be able to have more time with advisors and look to see if there's some names and that we haven't heard from recently, to really take advantage of the staff that we have assembled here and get some questions answered that way as well. And as we work through the queue, maybe we'll have time to get to some more questions from advisors. So if that makes sense for folks, I hope that's what we can do, and I'll turn it back to Leah. Thank you.
That sounds great. And first person from the chat is going to be Patrick. Patrick, go ahead and ask your questions live. It looks like you're unmuted, Patrick. We can't hear you if you're talking. Okay, Patrick, we see your questions in the chat and we can respond to you afterwards. They are all recorded. Our next hand is from Colby. Colby, go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, I have a couple questions. I represent basically, I fish 10, 11, and 13 as far as marine areas. And my biggest questions are, I was at the Sportsman Show last year and I saw a gear restriction, and that was pretty plain and day results from your test fishery boats on gear sizes and gear restriction. I know we already have barbless hooks in requirement and a maximum of 2 hooks. I would love to see more gear restrictions in place. I was out fishing today in 13, fishing big lures, big hooks, and I did not hook up to one sublegal Chinook. And then as far as that goes, as far as size restrictions, which is another question that I have, I would love to see a maximum. There's no point in keeping a fish, in my opinion, over 20 pounds in the Puget Sound. They are very hard to come by, and those are the fish that we want to protect. There's very few fish, but they are being caught in native nets out there that are still in the Puget Sound. There are 40+ pound Chinook in the Puget Sound. Like I said, they're very hard to come by, but they are out there. And then my last question is, we have these hatchery only fisheries, which are marked select. I would love to see those go throughout the whole season. Why open it up to wild fish when we have these ESA selective fisheries that are obviously endangerment to not only local waters, but the nation? I would just love to see that just carry out through the Puget Sound. It sucks that we would have to close the season earlier because of these wild fish that we need to protect, but that's why they are protected, is to protect them. So those are my 3 questions. I know it's a lot, really fast, but those are just my 3 topics that I'd love to cover for my fellow anglers in the Puget Sound. Thank you.
So I think I'll jump in first if everyone's okay with that, Colby, on the gear study, because that was my study. You probably saw me speak to that at the Sportsman Show last year. So that study is ongoing, and we are, I have now another full year of data, so it'll make 3 full years of data that I have for on the study, looking at the test fishing data that we've been collecting. So I do plan on having kind of an update to that, probably during North of Falcon 2 this year, to kind of give more of an update. At this point in time, we did see some differences with those gear types in different areas. It was very season and area specific. There's pretty significant spatial and temporal trends. So kind of having a blanket Puget Sound rule is not necessarily the way to go on this, at least from the data we've seen so far. Again, there's some of those areas had kind of smaller sample sizes than others, which is why we're kind of continuing this on. I think we'll always continue to collect this gear data as we're doing test fisheries. But in the meantime, you know, there's no rule again that says you have to use a small gear. If folks are going out and using larger gear, that's great. And I love to hear about that. I love to hear that people are doing that and seeing what they're catching. So in the meantime, you know, we do recommend to folks, especially in some of those winter fisheries, when we know we have smaller fish in the area, yeah, use bigger gear. The data does show that there is some effect. It's not necessarily what I would say actionable right now. We're not going to actually go out there and make a law about it. It would be really difficult to enforce, number one. And number two, again, we're still collecting that data just to see where that gets us. So that's what I can say about the gear study, but it's great to hear that, you know, you have been kind of partaking in it on your own and seeing what you got there. I think the second part of your question was about hold on, remind me what the second part of your question was.
Sorry, I don't want to jump too far forward with the second part of the question, which was size restriction, limiting it to a maximum. But as far as gear restrictions, we have barbless hooks are required. I have not been checked by one law enforcement agent in the past 5 years as far as fishing in the Puget Sound, and I'm an avid angler in the Puget Sound as far as using barbless hooks. I have actually been contacted more by the Coast Guard than I have a game warden as far as what I'm using. So the fact that you can't implement it and set it as a gear restriction is, I don't mean to be too straightforward with it, but it's kind of, it hurts to hear that, honestly, because we already have gear restrictions implemented already.
So I'm not saying that we can't do it. I'm gonna let Mark, I saw Mark getting ready to jump in, so I'm gonna let him speak to it as well.
Kirsten was headed down the right road, Colby. It's not that we can't do it. I think from our perspective, we need to understand the implications of a rule change like that. You know, remember, there's lots of fishing shops around Puget Sound that have already bought gear for the upcoming year, and if we made a significant gear change without some significant public outreach and at least some more data to support any decision that we may land on, I think we would, plus, you know, having conversations with our co-managers before we would implement anything like that, I think are all things that we would want to check the box before we would go down the road of doing large marine area gear changes for the upcoming year.
I appreciate that answer, and I'm sorry to push back again, but it's really hard because barbless hooks are not a size restriction. You can have all the way down to as small as a hook as you want with a barb on it, or without a barb on it. I'm sorry, I apologize for that, but you can have down to as small as a hook as you want with a barbless hook, and it's still legal in all marine waters. But you do have, I believe, a size restriction up to a 3/4 or 7/8 hook gap. As long as it's barbless, it's legal. So that's kind of it's a really tough question to ask, but it should be asked because there's also rivers in the Puget Sound and other parts of Washington where bait is restricted. That's another gear restriction that it's like I said, I don't mean to be a devil's advocate, but it's a question that has to be asked because gear restriction, as of my hard data and as of your guys' hard data in the Puget Sound Area 10, size restriction on your lures, bigger lures produce bigger fish. It's plain and day.
Thanks, Colby. I think there was one other aspect, I think, in the question here, and then let's move to another
Yes.
person. But Colby, you had asked, I believe it was, why don't we have a restriction that would require folks to release fish above a certain size? And so, Mark, can you speak to that?
We've considered different size restrictions within different marine areas over time. In the recent past, there has been proposals from the angling public to basically raise the minimum size limit specifically for Area 7 to help reduce the impacts on particularly Stiligwamish stock in that area. It's complicated as we start adjusting sizes for different marine areas or consider different size limits. In my 20+ year career, I don't remember us implementing a slot limit for salmon in a marine area fishery where we would have an upper bound. I certainly think it's if it were a proposal, we could evaluate it and consider that as part of the Nordic Falcon process this year. But I don't know if any of my teammates have any other knowledge or history that they want to bring to the table here, but that's my recollection on that issue.
I might just add, Mark, historically it was a little different. Now all of our Puget Sound Chinook fisheries are mark selective. So if we had a maximum size limit, we'd be telling someone, you just caught a big hatchery fish and now you have to let it go in the case of Chinook. So that's an argument we would hear against enacting a maximum Chinook size limit in Puget Sound.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, Colby. Leah, do you want to highlight the next? Great.
Yeah, our next question in the chat is from Randy. Randy, go ahead. Randy, I have prompted you to unmute.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so I just have a couple of questions, or actually a question and then a comment. So I'm up here in Whatcom, Skagit County, and we have Whatcom Creek that there were several thousand Chinook, and we were all complaining there's not enough Chinook salmon. There's several thousand Chinook that weren't allowed to spawn. Basically, they wouldn't let water out. There's, the state or the city wouldn't let water out to let them go up and spawn naturally. So they just let them get netted. And then you have the Samish hatchery that I live really close to, their holding ponds. I went back and forth there for a couple of weeks. We let thousands, probably 5,000 to 10,000 fish just die below those bladder dams they have. Why not let those go up and spawn? I mean, the Billingham Bay fishery that is open for those Samish fish is an either or, marked or unmarked fishery. Why not let them go up and spawn? You put more fish in the water. I mean, that's just 2 rivers in a small area. I'm sure there's other places where the same thing has happened. We let fish just die and at least not give them a chance to go up and spawn. And my question is on the Stiligwamish, why don't we just tell them to stop clipping their fish, wire tag them? If they would stop clipping those fish, there'd be less of an impact because nowhere in Washington can you keep an unmarked fish. Now they say they won't be able to tell where the fish are being caught. They should have more returning because they shouldn't be kept anyway. I mean, it doesn't make sense to clip the fish and then put a limit on the fish can be caught. Just don't clip them, wire tag them. I mean, it doesn't make sense when you clip them because then people can keep them. So that's it. That's what the really big one is why we wasted probably 10 to 15,000 Chinook in just two small river systems, a creek and a river. Why we let them go to waste?
So I'll try to take that first part, Randy, and then I think Derek is gonna hop on for the second piece of your question. The two systems that you talked about, the Chinook salmon raised, they're both from hatcheries. So the Whatcom Creek hatchery has a really small program. It's a demonstration program that is a cooperative endeavor with the Lummi Nation and the department, and I believe it is run with the Bellingham Technical College staff as part of that curriculum for that program. So those fish are either intended for harvest or returned to the hatchery for brood stock. If they're not harvested before they get to the Whatcom Creek, then they're not really suitable for fisheries. And I know there's been a lot of enforcement and other challenges around that Whatcom Creek zone since we started that project. Same thing with the Samish hatchery. We have quite a robust Chinook salmon program out of the Samish. We do not want all those hatchery fish to go above the hatchery rack and spawn. That would not be appropriate. So I know we've had some pretty significant returns to the Samish in recent years, and I believe there's some current infrastructure improvements underway to try to help us deal with some of that return and increased harvest levels as we've increased that production to help feed southern resident killer whales.
So why wouldn't you let those Samish river fish go up? I mean, what's the reasoning behind it? Other than they came out of a hatchery, they would still be fish. I mean, and that's our goal, is to increase the number of fish, if I'm hearing correctly. More fish equals more opportunity and more food for everybody out there.
I don't think more fish equals more opportunity when we're limited by natural stocks in really low abundances. The problem isn't the amount of hatchery fish to harvest, it's the amount of wild fish available that we impact and kill while we're trying to get to hatchery fish.
We'll have to agree to disagree on that. So what about the Stillaguamish?
Yeah, let's move on to the question about Stillaguamish, Chinook, and the marking aspect. Derek, can you cover that?
Yeah, thanks, Nate. And that was a great question, Randy. So for the Stillaguamish is, of course, a stock that we manage domestically. We also have international management obligations on the Stillaguamish with the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And through those international obligations, we need to have coded wire tag returns to evaluate to ensure compliance with our treaty with Canada, the Pacific Salmon Treaty. As a part of that, the reason why they have to be marked for those coded wire tag releases is because a lot of fisheries along the West Coast are only designed to sample marked fish. For example, many of the Canadian fisheries and many of the Alaskan fisheries. And then even in some of our own recreational fisheries where it's mark selective, we wouldn't get coded wire tag recoveries, and it would be hard to evaluate the impacts on Stillaguamish if all those fish were unmarked and coded wire tagged rather than marked and coded wire tagged. So it's kind of an evaluation purpose as to why we need to be marking and tagging those fish.
Okay, our next hand is from Scott. Scott, go ahead.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I mainly fish in area 11, some in 13. I want to just be very honest with you guys. I'm very frustrated. I have fished out here for over 50 years. And to see 11 managed the way it is just very frustrating. We missed out, I believe we missed out on pretty much all of the Puyallup run and the Nisqually run getting shut down by July 15th. And I believe the encounters, all these these sublegal encounters and all of that, I think are very low numbers. Area 11 is very far away from the Stillaguamish River. So I don't think the impacts are very high. And then we get very low numbers to begin with, much lower than areas 9 and 10. So then by August, from Port Townsend all the way down to the Narrows Bridge, closed for Chinook. Absolutely unacceptable. And I have seen time after time, and I know this is before your guys' time, but I sure fished the bottom fishery out here back in the 80s. Those are all gone. Mismanagement. Guys let the draggers in. I sent in to Mark and an email just saying a lot of this stuff. And all I got back was kind of a form letter. I also sent it to Jim Gorg of the Real News. He printed it in the September issue. And he printed the form letter that you guys sent in the October issue. So if you guys want to review it, go right ahead. It's in those issues. But I mean, I have never been so ticked off and frustrated in my entire life with this fishing. I started fishing when I was 5.5 in a pond. I grew up out here. I caught my first legal fish in Puget Sound over 50 years ago. And this is just, it's appalling. And yeah, you can spend $5 a gallon running to the ocean, chasing down 1 or 2 fish here and there. It just, there's guys in the boat lockers down here at Point Defiance. Some of them don't even have trailers for their boats. So it's Area 11, maybe Area 10 if they run a bunch of gas up, or Area 13 and run a bunch of gas to go down there. Area 11 is just really getting the shaft here. And it is just, I don't know. I mean, maybe it'd be better to open 11 a little bit later. That would be the Puget Sound committee that could maybe do that when the Puyallup run maybe shows up a little bit more. But it's really disheartening to have it open the 1st of July and it's twos and fews out there. And then all of a sudden the 15th shows up. Oh, you've gotten all the encounters. We left about 4,000 or 5,000 fish on the table. Wonder what happened to those fish. I'll bet you the hatcheries had so many surplus, and the buyers of the cat food and the fertilizer industry got overloaded. What happened to all those excess fish that we should have caught? We should have been able to catch. We buy those fish with our licenses. We pay for all this, and we're denied even access them. It's just absolutely disheartening. And then I send you guys an email and I just kind of get back some form letter that is just whatever. There's got to be a way to re-manage this thing than this.
Thanks, Scott. There was a lot in there, and understand the level of frustration that you shared. Dr. Simonson, can I ask you, I'm not going to ask you to call up the PowerPoint again, but could you just provide just a quick sketch again of what was the main takeaways as far as what happened for Marine Area 11 in particular, just in case Scott missed that part. I just think that's an important point to take another lap around the track, please. Thanks.
Yeah, just really briefly, that fishery was closed down due to 2 different things. It was sublegal encounters and it was unmarked encounters. Those were the two big ones. So the June fishery was primarily unmarked encounters, and the July fishery was both sublegal and unmarked encounters. And I know that there's been talk about the unmarked fish that are in Area 11 and how far away it is from Stilly, but I want to just take the second to remind everybody that all Puget Sound Chinook are ESA listed. So even though it's not necessarily a lot of still Squamish impacts in that area, it does not mean that there's not all other ESA listed stocks that are impacted. So I just wanted to kind of refresh that. And I see that Derek just turned on his camera, so I'll pause and see if he has anything to add.
Yeah, so you're right, Kirsten, that it isn't only Stillaguamish, and particularly when we're looking at Area 11, when we were in the preseason planning process last year, we were looking at Nisqually, and we were looking at balancing kind of where, since we were over on our Nisqually impacts as we were leading up to the final model runs, we were looking at how we would balance opportunities in different areas. And the Nisqually River did have kind of quite a reduced season this last year. So as Kirsten mentioned, there are kind of multiple factors that go into some of these decisions that we make, and Nisqually was a stock that was really of concern as we looked at Area 11.
Thanks, everyone. Our next question is from Dave. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I want to switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the impact of protected runs, the impact of endangered runs. What we haven't talked about is conflicts where co-management really sparked the closure, right? And I wanted to talk about specifically the Squamish River. For years, me and my family and friends have fished that river and created bonds and friendships, and to have it taken away because of conflict between tribe and co-managers is incredibly frustrating. And
Uh-oh, it looks like we lost him. I think he must have dropped the call. Let's go to the next hand. It is Jeff. Jeff, go ahead.
I just wanted to thank you guys for, can you hear me? I wanted to thank you all for very, very good, clear, clean presentations. Had a question about whether the size of Chinook in the summer fisheries has changed, especially on those kind of high catch days. On the first day something opens, since largemouth fishing's been closed in 6 and 7 and 9 for few years now. Are people just catching a lot of 6 to 10 pound Chinook and filling up our summer fishery with those fish?
So I'm gonna jump in real quick. Jeff, is there a marine area that you're particularly looking at, or just in general?
9, 7.
Okay. So I don't have that data right in front of me, but if you send me a quick email, I can pull that data and get something over to you to share, and we can add it to the material that comes with this presentation as well. That'll be up on the website. I don't have the specific size length data in front of me, and I don't want to take up a whole bunch of time trying to dig around for it. So just shoot me a quick email, and I'll make sure I get that out to you.
I'll do that. Can I take one more quick one while I'm here? Yep. One of the things Mark mentioned on his slides was trying to increase time on the water. I'm wondering whether you've considered some sort of a limited entry approach for these summer fisheries, even numbered wild IDs, odd numbered wild IDs or something. I know I participate in Area 9 and I catch my fish, but I'm usually pissed off by the time I get home. So, I mean, the crowds are just insane, and you're seeing it in your catch data. So is there a way to limit entry in a way that's fair and equitable, that will increase the quality of the experience for the people who are fishing? Thanks.
I'll try to take a stab at that one, and thanks for the question, Jeff. I can't say that we haven't bantered that around. We constantly try to think of new and different ideas. And we have obviously the hunting side of our house that does tag draws and different things like that to allow for some opportunity. I think when it comes to managing large marine area fisheries, it really becomes more of an enforcement issue. I don't think that we have enough enforcement staff to be able to monitor a large marine area like Marine Area 9 and check everybody's licenses to make sure that it's your day to be out there fishing Marine Area 9 for Chinook. I think it's a novel idea, and I wouldn't be opposed to exploring new and different ways for providing opportunities like that. I think we're just challenged under the current framework of how we do business to try to implement something like that. But I totally appreciate kind of the out of the box thinking, and just rest assured that we do think about things like that too.
So I just want to do just a quick process check before we go to the next question. We're scheduled for tonight's meeting from 6 to 8 o'clock. We're about 5 till 8 now, and there's still 15 or so hands up and a number of questions that are coming onto the chat that we can see as panelists. So how about this? I just want to just propose something here, especially to the director and the fish program director. How about we just go to 8:30? We'll try to take as many questions as we can during that time. And folks, what we'll also do is ask you to also go ahead and put your question in the chat. And what we'll do is we'll download the chat materials from this meeting, and then do our best to provide some responses, and then post that to the website associated with this meeting. So I think that's a way forward. I want to pause here just to see if there's any concerns, and otherwise we'll proceed. All right, thanks, Director. Okay, Leah, let's go to the next question, please.
Okay, our next hand is from Peter. Peter, go ahead.
You guys there?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so I have several questions. I'm a native from Whidbey Island, lived here my whole life for 40 some years. And I've just seen a lot of things change and a lot of questions more than answers. So I have several, and I'll try to make it quick. So first off, you were talking about the coho, and I'm basically on here for blackmouth. But coho, the biggest thing was you said that you could do beach fishing. It wouldn't impact anything with the blackmouth or king salmon going in and out. When you know that you've met your needs at the hatchery, why can't we get extended fishing? I'm a Whidbey Islander. I fish on the beach. I'm a beach fisherman basically for coho. That's my first question. And then the blackmouth questions later. So do you want me to ask one at a time, or would you guys like to just do it all together?
One at a time.
Peter,
It's easier to track.
Let's do the first question. We'll do the second one, and then we'll keep rolling here.
Yep.
Go ahead.
So is the coho. So why won't you open it for beach fishing after you've reached your hatchery goals? And this year was one of those exceptions that we had more fish than you needed, and we could have kept fishing on the beach, and it didn't open. It didn't stay going. I mean, coho's the lowest on the totem pole other than pink salmon.
So Peter, I want to make sure I'm following your question. Are you talking about beach fishing for coho in Marine Area 9?
Correct.
And are you talking about beyond kind of the end of the season? I think this year we extended into October.
Yes. Gotcha. And I thank you guys for that, but it should keep going, I think, especially when the fish. So
I appreciate that, Peter, and you'll probably remember back, in the mid-2010s that we actually carved out some beach fishing when we had a bunch of other coho seasons closed. So that's something that we can consider definitely going forward this year. I think one of the challenges for us, because there's so much beach access in Marine Area 9, it's really hard for us to get an assessment of kind of what that effort and catch looks like. Not that, you know, we need to have an exact number, but you know, we'll add that to our list of considerations for this year. I think you're right. I think the amount of beach fishermen and that opportunity, you know, the resources, you know, obviously not knowing forecasts yet, but the relative impact of that fishery on those coho stocks would be relatively low.
Well, I think you guys are pretty right on with our summer king season. I mean, I know it's crazy out there. We got a lot of people out there more than ever. So the biggest thing that I was thinking about was the Area 9, Area 6 East, Area 8-2 Blackmouth. It hasn't been open for a few years, and there's a lot of guys around here that's how we feed our families. So did you guys get that?
So I think I'll take a stab. I saw Derek turned his camera on there. I touched on it a little bit in my presentation, and I think Derek may have touched on it briefly too. Those winter fishing opportunities are really expensive on our stocks of concern, particularly the Stillaguamish stock. And you know, as I stated in my section, in recent years, you know, because we have such a limited amount of Chinook impacts, anglers have preferred to use those available impacts towards summer fishing opportunity. I think we've done, you know, in previous years during North of Falcon, we've taken a look at, you know, what it would mean if we were to open some of those fisheries, and the reductions that we would have to take in those summertime fisheries are basically almost to the point of no summer fishing, just to allow for some winter fishing opportunity. So I'll kind of stop there and see if Derek has anything he wants to add to what I said.
I think that was a great response, Mark, and you kind of captured most of what I was going to say. I did notice that Peter had spoken specifically to Area 8-2. I guess the other consideration there when we think about Chinook is that for the past few years, we've been below our low abundance thresholds for some of the Skagit stocks, and last year in particularly, Snohomish was also of concern. So given that there are so many stocks of concern right there for Chinook in that Area 8, it's been a little bit of a challenge in recent years.
Okay, our next hand is from David. David, go ahead.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great, thanks. Just one a comment and a question. First comment is just to consider how you schedule the seasons. You end up creating a little bit of a bonanza mentality. You know, if only Area 11's open, say in June, it gets all the pressure and we blow through quota. And it may be something where if all the areas open around a similar time, you're going to spread that pressure out. You're seeing increased, you know, anglers in your numbers, but you're really forcing that same group in all the different areas, and potentially those anglers are double counted. My question deals with the Stilly though. What are we doing besides just, you know, keep reducing recreational angler opportunities to bring back that stock? Is there anything else that we can do? Maybe using the Scotty's, you know, egg incubators that go into the rivers, or what else besides, you know, kind of taking it off the back of the recreation angler just to decrease our catch to bring that fish back? What else can we do?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab and see if there's anybody else on the team that wants to speak to this. There's been an incredible amount of effort that has gone into working on different recovery and other conservation impacts in the Stillaguamish. That's specifically around habitat protection and improvement. There's been quite a bit of staff time, legislative support, you know, other forms of support that have gone in to help rebuild that stock. So I see Derek turned his camera on. I don't know if he wants to speak, but I think, you know, we're really at the point from fisheries that we've done all we can, and I don't want to move past this without really acknowledging that the Stillaguamish tribe has also made some great sacrifices in their fisheries, right alongside the state, to allow for, the recovery and rebuilding of this stock in their native river. And I wouldn't want to kind of move past this item without acknowledging, kind of the shared sacrifice that we have as co-managers.
If I could add a little bit to that, Mark, you touched a little bit on the habitat and some of the fishery side of things. Maybe just two other actions that I might mention is that through our Pacific Salmon Treaty, through negotiations that occurred there are limits on the Canadian ISBM fisheries now. Those were first agreed to in 2019 for Stillaguamish. So there's Canadian management objectives that are established in some of their fisheries. And then in addition to that, and more from the modeling side, something that I'm a little bit excited about is that we've been funding different projects through the Pacific Salmon Treaty to identify kind of what changes we could make to habitat or what factors best affect kind of Stillaguamish productivity so that we can direct future projects to maximizing increased Stillaguamish productivity in that system.
Thanks, Derek. And I just would want to call out, there's a pretty informative web page on our site for if you go to our homepage in the search function, type in Stillaguamish restoration. There's quite a suite of actions that the department and the tribe and other partners are doing to try to recover Stillaguamish and really in support and acknowledgement of what a constraining stock the Stillaguamish population is.
Okay, our next hand is from Mike. Mike, go ahead.
You guys have a tough job. I've got a lot of my stuff already in the comments. I guess the one that I want, the two that I want answered or would like an answer to are the Muckleshoot releasing 1 million unclipped coho, and that just seems like that's going to cause negative impacts on 9 and 10. We're going to be throwing away a lot of fish. We're going to be encountering a lot of fish, which is then going to, have impacts. So are you changing your process in any way to account for these millions of fish that are coming? And we already saw them this last year. They were all like dollar bill sized fish that we were just, we could just tell, oh, they released them. Here they are. So how are you not going to shut us down? That's one. The other one is I'm actually interested in acquiring your design documents, if you have them, on how you actually estimate encounters. All of your data that you use, for your observations become estimates. All of this stuff feeds into that. I'd actually like to write a program to duplicate that and run some sensitivity analysis on the parameters and understand, get a sense that, yeah, this is good science, or there's some problems here with some of the math, the statistics. So is that possible to get?
So I can answer that last question. We do have a document that talks about how we do the estimate calculation. It's a PDF document that we publish. If you send me an email, I can get that out to you. So just shoot me an email. I'll send you along that document so you can take a look at it. And then if you have any more questions, just feel free to get back to us. The question about the Muckleshoot coho, one thing I want to remind folks is that Central and South Sound coho is non-selective. So whether the fish are area 10 and area 11 are non-selective for coho. So so unmarked coho in those areas wouldn't affect it. I'm going to let Mark jump in and kind of give a better answer, but that's just one thing I wanted to point out as well.
So I guess I hear this allegation quite a bit, that the Muckleshoot tribe is releasing millions of unmarked coho into Central Sound through their net pen program. I feel like we have a really good working relationship with the Muckleshoot tribe. I don't have the release numbers or the release information in front of me, but I'm fairly certain that we work together on the marking programs We work really closely with our co-managers on, the marking statewide of these stocks. I don't, like I said, I can't confirm or deny at this point because I haven't looked at the information about whether the muckleshoot program is entirely unmarked. But I don't think that's the case.
Okay, our next question is from David. David, go ahead.
I think you came back to the same David that asked a previous question. Just to follow up, because I think I was muted there in regards to the Stilly, though. I know Scotty's offers some in-stream incubators where you take some of the fish and they're stripped of their eggs and then allowed to essentially reproduce or have those eggs in those incubators in the river to come back. And you get a much higher hatch rate, around 98% instead of the 2% you get of the wild. Has anything been considered like that for the Stilly?
Do you want me to take this one, team? So I don't know specifically if those things have been considered for the Stilly. The hatchery, from what I understand, the hatchery program on the Stilly is a conservation program. So it's really, it's not meant for, like a harvest program. There's other limits that are part of that production that try to meet those conservation goals as a conservation hatchery program rather than a program destined for additional harvest opportunities.
Thanks, Mark. Our next question is from Alex. Alex, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, guys. Wow. There is no possible way for your stakeholders, us, to divulge into everything that you gave to us here tonight. I suppose I should thank you for at least the opportunity that we have. There is so much to go over here. I would hope that in the essence of a true town hall, that maybe in future events that it is more guided towards your stakeholders, the ones that you actually represent. So I'll try to maybe go over some of this as quickly as I can. I see a concerted effort to model things with a catch effort strategy or a catch per day strategy. I think it's incredibly important to note that catch success is going to be determined by frankly derby style openings that we're now subjected to, openings that force us to be in one specific area at one specific time. And as to what's been talked about is as far as even area 7 or 9, we're guaranteed a 3-day opener. So of course the pressure in those areas are going to be increased. And of course we're going to see catch per day correlated, to that season structure. I'm going to make sure I take a moment here real quick to speak to whoever else might still be on this call throughout all this, endured all this, that folks, don't get discouraged. Folks, this was a lot of information that was forced onto us in a very quick matter that is very hard to digest. I myself am having problems with digesting and going through all of it and being able to keep track of everything that was discussed. Don't be discouraged, folks. Please continue to stay involved, continue to participate in the meetings as they're scheduled. And I'll leave it at that. Don't be discouraged, folks. Now, as we move forward through the NOF process and to these next meetings that are going to be in front of us, I'd hope that we don't spend 75% of our time reviewing things that that are pertinent, or that the department feels is pertinent, that we actually allow opportunity for us to get to the brass tacks of things, and to get to questions and concerns, and to get to us actually being able to ask you on accountability issues, and how things are being managed or mismanaged, as some may put. And so I do have a couple actual topics I want to discuss here.
Hey, Alex, I
No,
really appreciate that you have a topic. So why don't you ask a question, and then you stated a lot here. Good comments. We've been trying to make this information accessible to all. Why don't you ask a question, and then we'll move on to others, because I know you also want to get to more questions as well.
Ask one quick question, Nate, here first.
Thanks.
And first, I'd say that any notion that an advisory member should not ask any technical question during any of these town halls is absolutely asinine, as far as I'm concerned. Any advisor should be able to ask any technical question and have you answer it in front of a public forum. But I will
absolutely, Alex. You know, just very quickly on that.
20,000 over 20.
Alex, I don't know, Leah, we can bring him back on. I just want to acknowledge here that we actually had a comment from an advisor suggests that we try to prioritize some of the comments from others, because there's going to be opportunities to interact with staff at an advisory call on Friday. So that was, we're trying to get to as many questions as we can, and
totally,
advisors also have a lot of access to staff and have a lot of questions. And so that wasn't out of disrespect. That was trying to acknowledge that there's a lot of other people, as you acknowledge, are trying to learn this, and we're trying to get to their questions. But go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll move to someone else.
Totally. This meeting wasn't announced to the advisors till after the department posted on their social media. But salmon, quote, salmon are an icon. Quote, the mandate for the department and primary goal is to sustain these salmon runs. What is the state's position on over 20,000 Chinook caught during BC trawl catch? When you have to abide by Pacific Salmon Treaty and Pacific Salmon Commission regulations, when the state of Washington, whom you represent, when you go to those meetings and when you participate in these commissions, what is the state's position on the excess of Chinook bycatch during ground trawl seasons?
I'm not sure who's best to answer that question, Alex, because nobody on this call sits in those, you know, kind of high-level Chinook discussions, other than maybe Dr. Dapp as our representative on the Chinook Technical Committee. I think that's a fairly recent revelation. I'm not sure that there's even been discussion on that at the PSC, different committees or groups that talk through these things. Obviously, the state of Washington has no authority over the government of Canada, right? We're part of a treaty with the United States and Canada, and Washington is part of that, you know, the US part of that treaty. So, you know, although Washington has a stake and is a big player in these discussions, it's a larger problem than just a Washington problem.
Thank you, Mark. Our next question is from Brett. Brett, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the time tonight. As I'm sure many on this call, I'm one that is a traveling fisherman. I try to fish for these precious animals around the state as often as I can, but I am a resident fisherman of Area 11 and live minutes from the Green River Hatchery. I think what I would want a better understanding of from the commission, and so I have a question and a suggestion, would be around the Area 11 kind of choppy way of the season's opening. It doesn't seem to benefit these sublegals or unmarked returning salmon in the month of June and even in the first parts of July. And so as an angler that tries to get out there as often as I can, I would propose having that area open similar to 9 and 10, that it would, one, I think, have less impact or keep us on the water longer, as well as spread out the pressure, as many people have noted on this call. And so I'd like to see or understand the benefit that it has to the June opener. I understand there's 1,000 fish that return to Minter Creek around that time, but to me, it seems that more net pens or returning jacks are an issue, which I don't know how you guys determine a returning jack or a sublegal in some of those encounter rates, and I'd like to maybe get a better idea of that. But I'll leave it with my suggestion. One, I'd like to propose something that some type of managed volunteer program. I've planted trees at my Green River. I've clipped fins at the hatchery, and something to the effect that where if an angler is willing to put in a certain amount of hours throughout the year as a volunteer effort through some type of licensed mandated program, that would allow for them to keep maybe one unmarked fish a year. I think it would be a good way of adjoining maybe the separation between the angler and the state and organizations as a way of trying to bridge that gap that I think is pretty prevalent sometimes. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Mark, are you gonna get that? Or are we gonna move next question? Okay,
Sorry,
Jesse.
I was distracted and didn't hear the entire question. If somebody wants to repeat it or take it for me, I'd really appreciate it. I apologize for that.
Mark, there was a couple comments in there. There was some suggestions on Marine Area 11, so I think that we can take that into account. And then there was a suggestion about, is there a way for us to reward volunteers that kind of go that extra mile, volunteer at a hatchery, engage in a restoration effort, and could they have an unmarked fish tag as a way to kind of contribute? So I think it's a thought for consideration, and I think we can go to Jesse.
Thanks, Nate. I appreciate that.
Awesome.
Go ahead. We can hear you, Jesse.
Oh, perfect. Great. First, I want to say, thanks so much for taking the time this evening. I know it's a very, complex process, and there's, a whole lot that needs to come together just for us to get on the water. So it's really great to get some time this evening. A couple questions. One, what are thoughts on shifting to more terminal fisheries? Like I know the bubble fisheries in marine areas have been much more consistent.
I think it's a great suggestion. I think it's something that we've been thinking about for a while. Once again, we'd have to be strategic. I think some of the successful one is around the Tulalip bubble. We could consider some other areas for that, but I think, we'd want to be really thoughtful about it. As far as where those might occur, where it made the most sense, where we've seen kind of, the bigger reductions in marine area opportunities, we'd probably want to focus our thoughts there just to provide some additional opportunity, maybe where it's been lost in the recent past, if we could. So I don't think it's a bad suggestion. I think it is something that we've kind of considered. It's harder, especially when you get down to the modeling and the evaluation pieces, to start splitting off marine areas and coated wire tag recoveries and try to make assumptions in the modeling about what kind of impacts you may have in a smaller geographic area as opposed to kind of the larger marine area. The data that's collected when we do collect coated wire tags on the back about fishing location isn't always that consistent or reliable. So it is a piece of data, but I think it just, as I said, as we move towards kind of reducing down larger marine areas and trying to evaluate those impacts, it just complicates the puzzle just a little bit more.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Our next hand is from George. George, go ahead. George, I have prompted you to unmute.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. I had a great time fishing this year in areas 9 and 10. I'm actually relatively new to salmon fishing. And I dropped by the locks, and the locks found that their returns of Chinook were about twice the 5 and 10-year averages, and their coho was about 4 times the return. And I'm guessing that that was not part of the original forecast. And I'm wondering, is there no way to figure that into the season? Because of course, area 10 closed early.
So again, George, we talked about this a little bit. You know, once those fish are in the locks and counted, they're not in marine area 10 anymore. So they're not necessarily available for harvest in that marine area fishery. And as we've talked about, our ability to assess what stocks were impacting in the marine area down to the stock specific level is not something that we can do like real time in season. We've thought about ways of trying to get at that question, but it really just becomes really daunting when you try to think through the complexities of all the different stocks and populations and management units that Kyle spoke about earlier, and all the different marine areas and the impacts on those stocks. It kind of becomes unwieldy. We have had instances in the past where you know, we're able to take advantage of those different abundances that show themselves. Those primarily occur in the freshwater fisheries, where we're able to provide either unexpected opportunity or increased opportunity in those freshwater areas based on the tools that we use and agree with the co-managers. So it's challenging. You know, I think that's the easiest, best answer I can come up with. And Kyle and Kirsten, if you have anything to add.
No, that's right on, Mark. With all the stocks out there, we don't have a way to know in marine waters if we have more total abundance than we expected, if we have less total abundance, if we have more hatchery fish, if we have more wild fish. There's just no way to sort that all out. Yes, we get data on individual returns once fish start entering places like the locks or hatchery racks, but there's just no real-time way to update the information we have that we use to plan marine fisheries, and no way to increase opportunity based on that.
So we have at least 9 hands up still, and we're coming up close to the end of time with the overage that we've added. So what I would ask is we'll have Joseph be the last question. For those that still have your hand up, if you haven't already and you want to submit a question, please put it in the chat. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll go back through the chat, identify themes and common questions, and then do our best to provide some answers and post that here in the next few business days. But let's go ahead to Joseph's question, and then we'll probably start heading towards closing out the meeting.
Go ahead, Joseph.
Hi there. I had a couple points. Marine Area 11. It was a very disappointing season. I know that most sports fishermen feel that the natives are getting 75% or more of the fish. I know this from crab fishing when I launched my boat in May, and the shores are blanketed with native traps. And when it comes to our turn, there's Sunday and Monday opportunity to crab fish. That's just crab. It goes on for the salmon too. We really, I feel we don't get our share. Is there any kind of transparency where we can see the native catch limits? And I know they've proposed that they be on our, they monitor our catches. Can we monitor theirs?
So I'll try to take a stab, and Kyle or others, if you want to jump in. We work really cooperatively with our co-managers. There are plenty of opportunities where we are alongside their staff, sampling their fisheries with them, collecting coded wire tag and catch information right alongside them, processing fish, all sorts of activities like that. I can't speak for the crab fishery and how that's managed. You know, there may be opportunities in different stocks or in different watersheds throughout Puget Sound where the tribes are getting more than the state for a particular stock or a particular management unit, and that often fluctuates year to year. We do have reports that we file for, our ESA reports that we produce that have, state and tribal catch in them. We are endeavoring to make those available on our website in the very near future. We're collecting lots of postseason evaluations as part of our recently adopted North of Falcon policy to try to do a better job of making that content public available and public facing for everybody to evaluate. But the reality is that it's a shared resource, and we do our best to balance the tribal needs for harvest and honoring their treaty rights, as well as fulfilling the needs of our fishers and our constituents with the available resources. So I think I captured everything there. Anybody else want to add?
I might just add, Mark, early in the meeting, I gave a really simplified version of explanation for mixed stock fisheries and talked about if we have one ESA listed stock out there with so many impacts available, and we divide those up between state and tribal fisheries. The tribal fisheries tend to be concentrated in extreme terminal, marine waters, and freshwater areas, really focused on the stock returning to that watershed. We choose to have state fisheries out in these mixed stock areas that are impacting stocks going all around Puget Sound and outside of Puget Sound. And it means we use our impacts differently. So we're not trying to divide up all the harvestable fish in Puget Sound and divide them 50-50. We're trying to figure out how to make the best use of our impacts on particularly these ESA listed stocks to access hatchery stocks. And that means we have a higher impact than our tribal co-managers on some stocks and a lower impact on some stocks. And that's just part of the complication of all this is we're making a choice to go fish these mixed terminal areas, and it makes our fishery planning more complicated and assessing how the harvest allocation works out over time more complicated.
All right. Well, want to just check in with the director, see if there's any closing remarks on his end.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Nate. Well, first, I want to thank everybody for being with us tonight. I know this is an investment of your time. Obviously, there's a whole lot to cover here. This is just the tip of the iceberg. I recognize there's a lot of frustration out there. That's why we want to have these meetings so you can hear from staff directly. I am going to double down on what I said in the beginning. The staff on this call do know these fisheries. The staff on these calls do participate in these fisheries, and the staff on these calls fight for every last fish they can provide to the non-treaty side. It's a complex business, but know that that's what they're trying to do. They also know the legal, technical, biological constraints we have to deal with. So within those constraints, can we do better? Always. We will always strive to do better. We want to hear from you. Our ears are wide open to hear ideas. I just ask that you come in with that collaborative effort to recognize there are constraints. Within those constraints, we will do everything we can for you. With that, I appreciate you all investing a whole night with us. And as you saw in the beginning here of the schedule, there are lots of meetings to continue the discussion. So thank you for your input.
Yeah, thanks, Director, and thanks to everybody that was able to join us tonight. We will download the chat and do our best to identify those key questions and themes and post the questions along with our responses here in the next few days. I want to thank the whole team here that took the time to prepare the presentations, share this information, and also thank the team that helped us producing the virtual town hall tonight and helping with the mechanics of Zoom. So our website is a great resource here for the North of Falcon meetings that are coming up in February through April, and look for additional opportunities there to engage in the salmon season setting process. Have a great night. Thanks, everybody.